There is a number that hangs over the desert city of Tucson, Arizona, a number that most of its residents have never heard, and that its leaders seem reluctant to say out loud. The number is a measure of distance, but not the kind of distance you drive or walk. It is a measure of the water level in a distant reservoir hundreds of miles away. A measure of how far the surface of that reservoir would have to fall before the water that sustains a significant part of Tucson's supply is cut off. And by this measure, the city sits perilously close to a threshold, close enough that the prospect of rationing, once a distant and abstract worry, has become a real and looming possibility. 14 feet. That, in the end, is the kind of margin we are really talking about. A small and shrinking cushion of water in a faraway lake standing between Tucson and the day when the city might have to tell its residents to cut back, to ration the water that has always seemed to flow so freely from their taps. And in the face of this looming threshold, something curious has happened. The city council, the body one might expect to be sounding the alarm, has instead gone quiet. This is the story of Tucson's increasingly precarious position, of the 14 feet that separate the city from rationing, and of the strange and troubling silence that has descended over the very leaders who ought to be confronting the crisis openly and head-on. To understand how Tucson came to sit so close to the edge, you first have to understand where the city gets its water, because Tucson's predicament is bound up in the sources it depends on and the fragility of those sources in an age of drought. Tucson sits in the desert of southern Arizona, a place that receives very little rain, and it could never sustain its population on its local rainfall alone. For much of its history, the city relied on the water beneath it, the groundwater pumped from the aquifers under the desert, but this groundwater was being drawn down faster than it could be replenished, threatening to run out, sinking the ground, jeopardizing the long-term future of the city. To relieve this pressure on the groundwater, Tucson turned to another source, to the water of the Colorado River, brought to the city across hundreds of miles of desert through an enormous canal system, the Central Arizona Project. This Colorado River water has become a crucial part of Tucson's supply, allowing the city to reduce its reliance on the depleted groundwater and even to bank some of the river water underground to recharge the aquifers. But this dependence on the Colorado River has also tied Tucson's fate to the health of that troubled river, and it is here that the danger lies. The Colorado River, as is now widely known, is in deep crisis, its flow diminished by decades of drought and chronic overuse, its great reservoirs fallen to alarming lows. The largest of these reservoirs, the one that stores the water for the lower part of the river and delivers it to the users below, has fallen year after year, its surface dropping toward the critical levels at which the deliveries of water must be cut. And this is where the 14 feet comes in, for the deliveries of Colorado River water to the users of the lower basin are governed by the level of that great reservoir, with cuts to the deliveries triggered as the reservoir falls past certain thresholds. As the reservoir drops, the cuts grow deeper, and the users who depend on the river face the loss of more and more of their water. The 14 feet is the margin between the current level of the reservoir and the next critical threshold, the point at which the cuts would deepen to the level that would seriously threaten Tucson's supply of Colorado River water and push the city toward the possibility of rationing. But Tucson's danger is not merely a function of the falling reservoir, for it is compounded by the particular position that Arizona occupies in the hierarchy of the Colorado River water rights, a position that leaves it especially exposed. The water of the Colorado River is divided among the states according to a system of priority, in which some users hold senior rights and are protected from cuts until the very end, while others hold junior rights and are cut first when the water runs short. In Arizona, in securing the funding to build the great canal that brings the river water to its interior, agreed long ago to accept a junior priority for much of that water, subordinating its claim to that of California. This means that when the cuts come, Arizona bears them first, giving up its water before the senior users in California are touched. And within Arizona, the water delivered by the canal is itself subject to priorities, with some users holding higher priority than others. This system of priorities means that Tucson's Colorado River water is among the more vulnerable in the whole system, exposed to the cuts that fall first and hardest on the junior users of Arizona, which is why the falling reservoir threatens the city so directly. Now, it is important to be clear and honest about Tucson's situation, because the city is not without defenses, and its predicament, while serious, is not the immediate catastrophe that the stark framing of the 14 feet might suggest. Tucson has, in fact, been a leader in water management, one of the most careful and forward-thinking cities in the region when it comes to preparing for scarcity. The city has banked a great deal of Colorado River water underground over the years, storing it in the aquifers in the wet times so that it can be drawn upon in the dry times, building a reserve that could cushion the blow if the river deliveries were cut. It has invested in conservation, reducing its per capita water use, and it retains its groundwater as a backup that it has worked to preserve. So Tucson is better prepared than many cities to weather a cut in its Colorado River water, with reserves and alternatives that could see it through a period of reduced deliveries without immediate rationing. The 14 feet, in other words, is not 14 feet from disaster, but 14 feet from the threshold at which the deeper cuts begin, cuts that Tucson could, at least for a time, absorb by drawing on its reserves. But this is precisely where the deeper concern lies, and where the silence of the city council becomes so troubling, because the reserves and the defenses that protect Tucson are not infinite, and the trajectory of the crisis is toward ever deeper cuts and ever greater strain on those defenses. The banked water underground can be drawn upon, but it is a finite reserve, and if the cuts to the Colorado River deliveries persist and deepen, as the trajectory of the crisis suggests they will, then the reserves will be drawn down, the cushion will thin, and the city will move closer to the point at which rationing becomes unavoidable. The 14 feet is not a wall that will hold forever, but a threshold that the falling reservoir is steadily approaching, and beyond it lie deeper cuts that would draw down Tucson's reserves and bring the day of rationing closer. The danger is not that rationing is imminent tomorrow, but that the city is on a trajectory toward it, that the margin is shrinking, that the defenses are being tested, and that without a serious reckoning with the crisis, the day will come when the reserves are exhausted and the rationing can no longer be avoided. It is worth understanding just how the mechanism of the cuts works, because it explains why a mere 14 feet in a distant reservoir can matter so much to a city hundreds of miles away. The deliveries of Colorado River water to the lower basin are governed by a tiered system tied to the level of the Great Reservoir, a set of thresholds that trigger progressively deeper cuts as the water falls. When the reservoir drops below one level, a first tier of cuts takes effect, reducing the deliveries by a certain amount and falling first on the most junior users. When it drops below the next level, a deeper tier of cuts takes effect, reducing the deliveries further and reaching more users. Each threshold is a step down, a deepening of the cuts, and the 14 feet represents the distance to the next such step, the next deepening of the reductions that would tighten the squeeze on Arizona and on Tucson. This is why the level of the reservoir is watched so closely, why every foot of decline matters, for each foot brings the surface closer to the next threshold and the deeper cuts that lie beyond it. The 14 feet is not an abstraction, but a countdown, a measure of how close the reservoir is to triggering the reductions that would strike at Tucson's supply. It is also worth appreciating the cruel timing of the crisis, the way the demand for water and the pressure on the supply tend to peak together, deepening the danger. The desert Southwest is hottest and driest in the summer, when the demand for water is greatest, when the cities and the farms draw most heavily on their supplies to survive the extreme heat. And it is precisely in the hot, dry conditions of a prolonged drought that the reservoir falls fastest, its surface dropping as the inflow dwindles and the evaporation intensifies. So the pressure on Tucson's water tends to build at the very moments when the city needs the water most, when the heat is greatest and the demand is highest, and the reservoir is falling toward the critical thresholds. This convergence of high demand and shrinking supply is part of what makes the crisis so dangerous, for it means that the squeeze on the water is tightest when the stakes are highest, when the failure of the supply would be most keenly felt. The 14 feet, in this light, is a margin that could shrink fastest in exactly the conditions when Tucson can least afford to lose its water. This is what makes the quiet of the city council so concerning, for it is precisely at such a moment, when a serious threat is looming but has not yet arrived, that clear and honest leadership is most needed, and yet the leaders have gone silent. There is a natural human tendency, when faced with an unwelcome truth, to avoid speaking of it, to hope that it will not come to pass. To spare the public the anxiety and the disruption that a frank acknowledgement of the danger would bring. A city council that stood up and declared that the city was 14 feet from rationing would set off alarm, would provoke difficult questions, would force a confrontation with hard choices about growth and water use and the future of the city. It is easier, in the short term, to say little, to manage the situation quietly behind the scenes, to avoid the political storm that a frank acknowledgement would unleash. And so the council has gone quiet, not necessarily out of negligence or malice, but out of the understandable, if troubling human reluctance to be the bearer of unwelcome news, to confront the public with a truth that no one wants to hear. But the silence, understandable as it may be, is also dangerous, for it leaves the public unprepared and the crisis unaddressed, allowing the city to drift toward the threshold without the reckoning that could help it avoid the worst. When the leaders go quiet, the public remains unaware of the danger, unmotivated to conserve, unprepared for the possibility of rationing, and the pressure to take the difficult steps that could relieve the crisis is diminished. The silence allows the city to continue on its current path, growing and consuming water as before, without confronting the fundamental question of how it will sustain itself as its Colorado River water grows more precarious. And it means that when the day of reckoning comes, if it comes, the city will be less prepared than it might have been, caught by a crisis that its leaders knew was looming but chose not to confront openly. The quiet of the city council is, in this sense, a failure of the leadership that the moment demands, a retreat from the hard truth telling that could help the city prepare for the future it faces. The situation in Tucson is, in a sense, a microcosm of the larger crisis facing the entire American Southwest, the crisis of a region that has grown beyond the limits of its water and is now being forced to reckon with that fact. Across the region, cities and states that depend on the Colorado River are facing the same fundamental challenge, the same shrinking supply, the same looming cuts, the same difficult choices about how to live with less water. And across the region, there is the same temptation to avoid the hard truths, to speak in reassuring vagueness rather than confronting the crisis openly, to hope that the drought will end and the reservoirs will refill rather than facing the possibility that the scarcity is permanent. Tucson's 14 feet and its silent council are a particular instance of a general pattern, the pattern of a region struggling to come to terms with the limits of its water, reluctant to speak plainly about the reckoning that is coming, drifting toward the threshold without the honest confrontation that the crisis demands. The story of Tucson is the story of the Southwest, told in the specific terms of one city's precarious position and one council's troubling silence. What would it mean for Tucson to confront its situation honestly, to break the silence and face the 14 feet directly? It would mean acknowledging the danger openly, telling the public the truth about the precariousness of the city's water supply and the possibility of rationing, and enlisting the public in the effort to prepare. It would mean accelerating the conservation, driving down the water use further, so that the city depends less on the vulnerable Colorado River water and stretches its reserves further. It would mean confronting the difficult questions about growth, about whether the city can continue to expand as its water supply grows more precarious, about how to balance the desire for growth against the limits of the water. It would mean planning seriously for the possibility of deeper cuts and eventual rationing, developing the strategies and the systems that would allow the city to weather the scarcity. All of this is difficult and unwelcome, which is why the council has been reluctant to embrace it. But it is what the situation demands. And the silence only delays the reckoning and leaves the city less prepared for the future it faces. There is still time for Tucson to change course, to break the silence and confront its situation, for the 14 feet, while a shrinking margin is not yet exhausted, and the city's reserves and defenses still provide a cushion. The danger is real, but not yet a catastrophe, and the window to prepare, while narrowing, has not yet closed. If the city's leaders were to find their voice, to speak honestly about the danger, and to lead the effort to prepare, Tucson could yet navigate the crisis, drawing on its reserves, deepening its conservation, planning for the scarcity, and perhaps avoiding the worst even as the Colorado River water grows more precarious. The story of Tucson need not end in rationing and crisis. It could end in a city that faced its situation honestly and prepared wisely, that used its remaining margin to ready itself for a drier future. But this outcome depends on breaking the silence, on the leaders finding the courage to confront the hard truth and to enlist the public in the effort. And it is precisely this that has been missing, the honest leadership that the moment demands. So Tucson sits 14 feet from rationing, a shrinking margin of water in a distant reservoir standing between the city and the day when it might have to tell its residents to cut back, its danger compounded by Arizona's junior position and the water rights that leaves it exposed to the first and deepest cuts. The city is not without defenses, with reserves banked underground and a history of careful conservation, but those defenses are finite, and the trajectory of the crisis is toward deeper cuts and greater strain, toward the day when the reserves are drawn down and the rationing can no longer be avoided. And in the face of this looming threat, the city council has gone quiet, retreating from the hard truth, telling that the moment demands, leaving the public unprepared and the crisis unaddressed. The silence is understandable, born of the human reluctance to confront unwelcome truths. But it is also dangerous, a failure of leadership at a moment when clear and honest leadership is most needed. The 14 feet is a warning, a measure of how close Tucson has come to the edge, and the silence of the council is a warning of its own, a sign that the city is drifting toward the threshold without the reckoning that could save it. Whether Tucson breaks the silence and confronts its situation, or continues to drift in quiet toward the day of rationing, is the question that hangs over the desert city, a question whose answer will determine whether it navigates the crisis wisely